Let me first and most importantly thank the extraordinary turnout, legislative leadership of the state, the Speaker, the Pro Tem, respective members of the Assembly and the Senate, statewide constitutionals, the Lieutenant Governor. It is humbling to see everybody here assembled today. I want to give some context to this moment and an expression of why we're here, why I'm here, and why I moved forward just moments ago with an executive order advancing a moratorium on the death penalty in California. This has been a 40-year journey for me. This is a journey that began with an introduction of an elderly man named Pete Pianesi. I was about 10 or 11 years old, and my grandfather introduced me to Pete. My grandfather had made it a life pursuit to address the injustice of Pete's arrest and prosecution for a crime he did not commit. Pete later became known as the bum rap kid. He was set up by the mob, set up to be executed, save for one individual on a jury that held out just on moral grounds, was absolutely convinced in Pete's guilt, sentenced Pete to 2 life sentences, but did not believe in the death penalty. Pete Pianesi would not have survived had it not been for that individual. That pursuit of my grandfather led to these halls here at the Capitol and to his relationship and friendship with then Governor Pat Brown. Pat Brown was convinced by the evidence that was provided to provide Pete a rehabilitative pardon. He was paroled from Folsom Prison, but he didn't get the full pardon. My father took that cause up years later as a member of the California Court of Appeals. He went in front of the prison board. He then appealed to his friend, Governor Jerry Brown, for that full pardon of Pete Pianesi. That was made much easier because in 1977, 40 years after Pete Pianesi's arrest in 1937, a guy by the name of Jimmy the Weasel Fratiani turned state's evidence, acknowledged that he was a hitman for the mob, and they had set up Pete. With that new evidence, the pardon was advanced. I was a young man learning that life story, and I also got to know Pete up into his dying days. And I also had the opportunity in that spirit to start thinking and to reflect on the death penalty, on its purpose, and on the passion that arises when we debate the issue. I had the opportunity for the course of years to listen to people on all sides of the aisle, visited San Quentin, went on death row, met in San Quentin a young man that was there that I went to high school with. Said, "Do you remember me?" The warden said, "He's actually a pretty good kid, but he killed his mom." I had a foster brother that spent time in San Quentin for crack cocaine dealing. Got to understand the racial disparities and 5-year mandatory minimum sentences for crack cocaine versus 5,000 grams of powder cocaine that would require that same minimum mandatory. I've gotten a sense over a course of many, many years of the disparities in our criminal justice system. I've heard from experts that have laid claim to what I think is a fair assessment of our criminal justice system, that it's a lot better to be rich and guilty than poor and innocent. We see those disparities manifest in reforms, and we see those disparities manifested in our politics every single day. We're living in an environment where we're seeing the manifestation of a lot of this politics, the politics of fear, the politics of anger, the politics of grievance. Very familiar to all of us here in California. I lived through the super predator generation. 3 strikes and you're out. We went to this mass over-incarceration, and now the pendulum's swinging in a new direction. But all the while, we had this fourth thumb that stood out in California, and that is we were laying claim to having the largest death row in the Western Hemisphere. The largest death row in the United States of America, 2 times the size of the next largest state, Florida. And it didn't necessarily square and doesn't necessarily square with, I think, the values that are represented in the folks behind me and represented in the hearts and minds of tens of millions of Californians. I think we're better than this. I believe in justice. I believe that crimes are so heinous that people should spend the rest of their life in prison. I have deep empathy for victims of crimes, and I believe in justice. But I'll never forget a young girl I, on a weekly basis, spent time in schools in San Francisco, said, so what you guys are telling me, she wasn't speaking to me, but more broadly because she had an assignment about the death penalty. She says, what you're saying to us as adults, that it's not right to kill, yet that's exactly what you're doing. This was literally my first term as mayor. It was around the time we had our last execution in California, 2006. Look, we have 737 people on death row today. 120 people have died, either of suicide or natural causes, including someone last week. Just 13 have been executed. And you, as taxpayers, you have spent $5 billion. $5 billion since we reinstated the death penalty in this state. What have we gotten for that? You had someone just last year that was released from death row after serving 26 years in San Quentin. You had someone in 2005 after spending 26 years, Patrick Croy, who was exonerated for the crime he committed. Since 1978 in this country, 164 people have been exonerated from death row, 5 now in California. What we're being tasked to do, and let me sum up, in California is to consider the following: to consider executing more people than any state in modern American history, to line up human beings every single day for execution for 2+ years. To line people up to be executed, premeditated, state-sponsored executions, 1 a week for over 14 years. That's a choice we can make, or we can make, I think, a more enlightened choice to advance justice in a different way. There was a National Academy of Science report that came out that estimates 1 out of every 25 people on death row is innocent. If that's the case, that means if we move forward with executing 737 people in California, we will have executed roughly 30 people that are innocent. I don't know about you. I can't sign my name to that. I can't be party to that. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. There are innocent people on death row. There are guilty people on death row. And those people are not going to be let out by this act. They will be held to account. But we don't want to join Saudi Arabia. We don't want to perpetuate what's happening in North Korea. We don't want to be part of what's happening in Iran and Iraq and China, Somalia, Pakistan, and Egypt. By the way, those were the countries, those last 5, that joined the United States of America in executing more of their citizens than any other nations on planet Earth. 3 out of 4 nations in the world know better and are doing better. They've abolished the death penalty. It's time California join those ranks. So I did this with a heavy heart, with deep appreciation for the emotions that drives this issue. And I did it with the victims in mind. And let me end with this. I have sat down this last week in a very intentional way with victims that represents all sides of this issue. I met someone yesterday who said this is about eradicating evil, and you have a responsibility to eradicate evil by executing those on death row. I met a mother who said, how dare you? You have no right to do this to my family. You won't be doing this for my family. You'll be doing this to my family. You have no right to take another life in the name of my daughter who was murdered. These are tough things to square. These are hard things to process. And for the grace of God, go any of us. And to the victims, all I can say is, we owe you, and we need to do more and do better. More broadly for victims in this state. That was one thing that came home to me in a very deep and impactful way. But we cannot advance the death penalty in effort to try to soften the blow of what happened. Final point. I was talking to Brian Stevenson. Everybody should spend time talking to Brian Stevenson. And he made a point he's made many, many occasions, and it just struck home with me. Struck a chord. He said, it's not the question, the death penalty, of whether or not people deserve to die for their heinous acts. The question really is, do we have the right to kill? Do we have the right to kill? And that's a deep and existential question. I don't believe we do. You know, I know those things, people think eye for eye, but if you rape, we don't rape. And I think if someone kills, we don't kill. We're better than that. So this moratorium advances that principle. We will reprieve those on death row. We're not commuting the sentences. People still remain in custody. We are no longer going to support the injection protocol. And we are, as I speak, shutting down, removing the equipment in the death chamber at San Quentin. Symbolically and substantively, to send a message that we're better than this. So with that, I want to just thank you all for taking the time to come out here, but I want to pay particular thanks to someone you may see behind me that's very recognizable, and that's former Senator John Burton. John was a big part of PPIN as his journey, a big part of my grandfather's life and my father's life, and a big part of the reason I'm standing here today. He's been a moral leader in positions of formal authority for a generation. And John, in 1965, before my birth, introduced a bill here in the Assembly to abolish the death penalty. And it means the world to me that John Burton joined us here today as well. Thanks for being here, John. I'm grateful to you. With that, happy to answer any questions. 2012 and 16.
And 2 years ago, actually voted in favor of accelerating it. How do you explain it to them? Why don't you define will or California?
Well, the people of the state of California have entrusted me by their will and by constitutional right to do exactly what I'm doing. And I'm in, and I'm, I don't know how clear I've been over the course of, as I suggest, 4 decades, crystal clear about my opposition to the death penalty. I don't think this comes as a huge surprise to anybody. And let me extend, the Constitution of the state of California affords me, the laws of the state afford me the right to do this. The law does not change as it relates to the death penalty. That can only change with the will of the voters or adjudication in the United States Supreme Court. And I'm hopeful that that will one day occur. I've spent time with them. I've listened to them. And all I can say is I have enormous respect and admiration for people that disagree. I'm not going to judge folks that have strong-held views on this. And for those victims, all I can say is that I, as a father of 4, I can't even conceive of their pain, can't even conceive of their suffering, can't even conceive of how they process the entire system of justice, let alone the issues related to the death penalty, and how every time these issues come up, once again, it opens up those wounds. And so my heart goes out to each and every one of them, and having heard from victims that feel very strongly on all sides of this issue, I can only express that people have deeply held beliefs that are very personal, and one must respect those beliefs. I'm sorry. I've been meeting, well, over the course of years, I've been meeting with dozens and dozens of victims. Over the course of the last few days, with a dozen or so victims, maybe perhaps more.
You said last year.
I'm sorry.
Take a wholesale step in this wholesale review. You could have granted repeal, say, as the case came up, you know, make presumers. What made you decide to do it this way as opposed to,
So two things that have happened, and I didn't anticipate happening this early. Next month, I was being asked the question of whether or not I would support the previous administration's effort to advance the injection protocol that CDCR had put up. I would be lying if I said I could support that. By definition, that action would have opened up these questions. I'd rather be forthright and transparent. When I ran for office, I said my why. I told every single one of you this. I said my why, my deeper why. Because I wanted to stand up for ideals and strike out against injustice. I've consistently said on ad nauseum occasions that I have strong held views of opposition to the death penalty, and that I will reserve my right when this comes in front of me to process this in a deep way. I believe I've done that. It's not flippant. I haven't come to this lightly, but that specific action precipitated a decision and a process that is unfolding in real time. Final point. There are 25 people now, 25, that have exhausted all of their appeals. It was 24 just 2 weeks ago. And this question is being called, not likely in the next administration, but likely in this administration. This was not a question that was being called in the previous administration, and that's why I feel compelled to be forthright and honest and to announce my intentions today. That's right.
isn't that what you're doing?
Yeah, well, as I said, the will of the voters is also entrusted in me on the basis of my constitutional right to grant a reprieve. I processed this after that individual was found innocent after 26 years of serving on death row, after the protocol came to me in a much faster period of time. I've had to process this in a way that I didn't frankly anticipate a few months ago. It was an abstract question. It's a very real question. Remember, the backstop for an execution for taking of another life is the governor of the state of California. And with respect to everyone here, when I was standing on this side and I wasn't standing here, it was an intellectual conversation. It's a very emotional place that I stand in. And so I am expressing this not from paradigm of politics. It's not a situational conversation for me. This is about who I am as a human being. This is about what I can or cannot do. To me, this is the right thing to do. Yeah.
Influence, or you hope it influences other states, but you see this as a sort of standalone thing, or as some sort of sweeping?
California is too big. It's a quarter of the nation's incarcerated, at least on death row. This is not like a lot of states in the past, 4 people, 3 people. It's 737 people, largest death row in the Western Hemisphere. I think California has played an outsized role in criminal justice reform, and it's played an outsized role in terms of an aggressive, fear-based approach to incarceration. So we've been on both sides of this. I hope this will prevail as a conversation anew on the death penalty in this country.
Governor, you've been
And sorry, Dan.
President Trump for overexerting his executive authority, his executive orders. Aren't there any parallels to what you're doing today?
No, I think the law is the law. This is crystal clear. The Constitution of the state of California provides the governor the ability to reprieve, ability to do this moratorium. I don't think there's any ambiguity, and with respect, I think you'll be hard-pressed to find, you'll certainly find 1 or 2 legal experts, but you'll find overwhelming majority of legal experts that feel we are on firm legal ground. Dan.
Do you expect this to be on the ballot in 2021? And then secondly, do you think California Supreme Court should process any more appeals?
Well, you can ask the Chief Justice how much time they're spent on just the death issue. In an ideal world, we wouldn't be prosecuting death any longer. Now, I could process that through the commutation steps, but as you know, Governor Brown had 10 commutations overturned in December. There was no public announcement or reasoning from the court. We need to understand that more fully before we move forward with next steps, potentially around commutation. Accordingly, there are a number of people behind me that have introduced, one individual, Mark Levine, others co-sponsored a constitutional amendment that potentially could place this on the 2020 ballot, and that will be determined through their legislative process, and if it indeed goes on the ballot, I certainly would be supportive.
So you do support putting it on the ballot?
Look, I did not introduce legislation support on the ballot. I'm taking this action, but I know that there's legislative interest in that, and ultimately, a way to end the death penalty in California is to go to the ballot. Inmates on death row will remain. No one's being released. Well, as you know, there was a legislative process last year that has allowed certain individuals that were previously on death row to be part of the general population. That process has already been taking shape. Excuse me, went right behind you, I'm sorry. That's right. It's court costs, et cetera. That's why we need to end the death penalty in California. If we're going to get to the cost issue, that's why we need to end the death penalty in California. That's why the people of the state of California, I hope, will end the death penalty to end the cost burdens, though this to me is not just about cost. $5 billion is not insignificant. By the way, $5 billion could have bought you a lot of justice for murder victims that didn't have their murders investigated. $5 billion could have bought a lot of justice to people that had inadequate representation at the time of adjudication. $5 billion could have bought a lot of justice in training on implicit and overt bias. $5 billion could have bought a lot of training to right the wrongs of a criminal justice system that is skewed against black and brown people. Look, I'm announcing what I'm announcing today. We can get to the next steps. My ultimate goal is to end the death penalty in California. My right, my constitutional right afforded to me by the people of the state of California is to advance the reprieve, this moratorium today. I have the right to shut down the death chamber at San Quentin. I'm doing that. I have the right to no longer support the injection protocols that were established by the previous administration. I'm doing that. I'm exercising the rights I have today. And to the extent that I have a right to move forward with commutations, that's a next step, and that will be considered. To the extent that I have a right as an individual and as a governor to support efforts to repeal the death penalty subsequently, either through voter initiative or through, I think, constitutional framework that ultimately I think should be addressed at the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, certainly we'll consider that as well.
I'm trying to understand why you changed your mind, because again, your campaign said last year, not just that you were going to get ahead of the will of voters, but that you respect what the electorate said by enforcing and implementing.
And I respect my right. And you guys can. I've made it. Yeah. Nothing changed my mind. I believe I'm doing the right thing, and to the extent that this issue is coming faster and sooner, and that I would be entrusted for executing 25 human beings, I can't do that. You want the answer to the question? It may not be the answer you're looking for. I cannot sign off on executing hundreds and hundreds of human beings, knowing that among them will be innocent human beings, regardless of whether or not you apply a point of view that is consistent with that. I respect anybody's difference of opinion. It's not an abstract question any longer. 25 people have exhausted all of their appeals. The protocol on the injection, those appeals are all but exhausted. This question is real. This question now is being presented to me, not as an abstract question, but as a question that goes deep to who I am and what I believe. And I believe the death penalty is wrong, and I'm exercising my right pursuant to the voters, the will of voters, and the Constitution to do that's right. Thank you. I'm sorry? People have the right. Look, we can move into the floor with all kinds of hypotheticals. We'll have to address them when they come in front of us. Anybody else? I'm sorry? Yeah, right now it's a little in excess of $150 million a year. All of that will be considered. Look, I feel very uncomfortable as an administration pursuing death. I would like to end that system. So as I suggest, we will consider all options moving forward. I've been very clear about what I've done to date, and I've also been clear about my opposition for 40 years to the death penalty. I hope that's consistent with the expectations many had that elected me last year. I'm gratified by those that have different points of view and express no ill will to those who have very strong feelings about this issue. I thank you all very much for your time and attention, and for everybody that is assembled around me here today. Thank you all very, very much.